Now, Virginia has additional protected classes. That would be elderliness, source of funds, sexual orientation, gender identity, and military status. Elderliness, that's basically protection for persons who are 55 and older. Source of funds, that would include any funds provided to or on behalf of a renter or home buyer, including any assistance, benefit, or subsidy program, where such program is administered by a government or non-governmental entity. The case that I wanted to share with you with regards to source of funds, that particular protection went into effect July 1, 2020. Well, as of October 2021, actually the Attorney General's office filed suit against 29, either it was management companies, real estate owners, property managers, who were located or operating in the Richmond Metropolitan Area. So that's Richmond, Henrico, Chesterfield, and where they were actually denying, these housing providers were denying access to their property to families who held housing choice vouchers. Well, the lawsuit was filed and it actually settled pretty quickly within about 90 to 120 days. And the settlement, I think, in my opinion, was relatively small because it was a little over $100,000. But the benefit of that, the real benefit that came out of that is that those particular housing providers had to change their policies and procedures and pay attention to the law to allow families who have housing choice vouchers um, access to their properties because they need that. And there is the stigma against folk who have housing choice vouchers, which this particular protection is absolutely wonderful to assist those families get the basic housing needs that they need. Which, and I'm not saying basic, but housing is a basic need that everybody has. Sexual orientation. It is illegal to discriminate against a person for their actual or perceived heterosexuality, bisexuality, or homosexuality. This would include discrimination due to someone's physical appearance, their mannerisms, the partner they choose to be with, or any self-identifying symbols or flags. Same with gender identity. It's illegal to discriminate against someone for their gender-related identity, their appearance, or other gender-related characteristics, with or without regard to that individual's designated sex at birth. And military status, that includes active military service members or veterans who have served in the active military, who were discharged honorably, and this also includes the family members of active military service members or veterans. So what type of housing is covered? Basically anything that you could call home. That would be a single family house, could be an apartment, could be a nursing home, dormitories, residential hotels, co-ops, timeshares, and certainly housing authorities. What is important here with the hotels or motels, it is considered a residence once you have occupied that space for at least for 90 days or more, or of course, if there is a lease agreement. So what does discrimination look like? Um, to refuse to rent or sell, an outright denial, or just a reluctance to provide service. Um, Offer of different terms and conditions, requiring additional screening or denying or limiting services to someone because of their membership of a protected class, to steer a potential tenant to a less desirable apartment, location, or area, or just basically misrepresenting the availability of housing. Where you know that you've heard or you know that there's something available, but when you actually call or when you show up in person, all of a sudden that space is no longer available. Advertising a preference or limitation. That includes oral or written statements that indicate a preference or a limitation. This could be certainly include words, photographs, or symbols. to threaten, intimidate, coerce, or interfere. Certainly, the holdup or delay in the processing or review of an application, pressure or bullying, threatening statements that could be verbal or written, pestering or stalking, all of those are potential discriminatory behaviors. And certainly sexual harassment by a housing provider is illegal under the Fair Housing Act, as well as other federal laws. It's also important to, to know that unlawful discriminatory actions can take place in any stage of the housing process. It could be the application process, during tenancy, occupancy, or at the termination of tenancy or occupancy. So how do you file a fair housing complaint? Well, anyone can file a fair housing complaint and it is at no charge. Fair housing complaints can be filed by any entity, including individuals and community groups. What's important here is sometimes people feel intimidated when they know something is wrong, but they don't know what to do with it. They feel like there may be retaliation should they complain about something, right? or complain about the action or the issues that are taking place. If you feel like something is not right and you're not being treated fairly and you have those concerns, of course, intimidation is also something that can be included in the complaint. But if you want to just let us know, you call home or you could call HUD or Virginia Fair Housing Office or Equal Rights Center. Well, certainly for home, you can call us and tell us what's going on, and we will, if you don't want to be a part of the complaint, that doesn't stop us from investigating the issue. If you do want to file the complaint, we actually assist you in writing that complaint to present it to the Virginia Fair Housing Office. It's important to note that complaints can be filed 1 year after the last discriminatory action. And you can also file a lawsuit in court within 2 years of the last discriminatory incident. Complaints can be filed, certainly, like I said, after moving out of the property. If something happened while you were there, you left, that does not stop you from moving forward with filing a complaint. So what happens with a complaint? Once it's filed, or say, for instance, home assists you in putting that together, it goes to intake to the Virginia Fair Housing Office. They will finalize the complaint with you, and you'll sign the formal complaint. Then there's an opportunity for mediation. You will have the opportunity to resolve the complaint via mediation if all sides are interested. An investigator will investigate the complaint and complete the investigative report to find either probable cause or no probable cause. If the case receives a probable cause finding, all sides will also have another opportunity for settlement. And if it doesn't, then it moves on to the Attorney General's office to prepare for for the case to be filed. If the second round of mediation is not successful, then I said, like, it is filed in court by the Attorney General's office. What's important too is, what's the time frame of all of this? Well, it depends on really, how things go with negotiations between the complainant and the respondent. It could take 90 days, it could take up to 3 years. So it's not something that often will be resolved immediately, but even with that, people should not ignore their right to be treated fairly. That is the end of my presentation. So I'm going to just stop sharing. Let's see, stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Regina. Yeah, if you want to just go ahead and stop sharing. Yeah, we can't see your presentation anymore.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
That lays the groundwork, and then we're going to have Susie McClanahan. I'm going to make you the presenter now, Susie, and Susie's going to talk about some other concepts also related to fair housing. So just give me one moment.
Great.
Thank
Okay.
you. Take it away, Susie. Thanks.
Perfect. I almost forgot to unmute myself, which I think I do every video meeting. Okay, so we're going to be discussing other fair housing concepts.
And Susie, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it looks like you also maybe are not in presentation mode. We're seeing like a preview of your next slide.
Okay, great.
Fine, but I don't, yeah.
I think it's, let's see. Nope. That should fix it. Are we good now?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. So I'm going to be going over some other fair housing concepts. First, I want to briefly introduce the Equal Rights Center. The Equal Rights Center is a civil rights organization that identifies and seeks to eliminate unlawful and unfair discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations in our home community of Greater Washington, D.C., as well as nationwide. Since today we're talking about fair housing, I want to talk a bit more about how we can assist individuals who might be experiencing discrimination in housing in the DC region. We do provide services to anyone in Northern Virginia, including Loudoun County, the District of Columbia, and the state of Maryland. If somebody believes they're experiencing discrimination, some of the services we may be able to offer include conducting advocacy directly with the housing provider to address the issue. For people with disabilities, we can assist them with submitting a request for reasonable accommodations or modifications to housing providers, which Regina touched on earlier. So for instance, helping folks transfer to a more accessible unit or have an assistance animal, such as an emotional support animal approved, or get an accessible parking space. We also assist people with submitting housing discrimination complaints to HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or the local appropriate government agency, and can serve as their non-legal representative throughout the process so that you have a better understanding of what's going on and can hopefully achieve a more satisfactory outcome. We also do civil rights testing, which I will demonstrate, give an example of in just a moment. And we do accessibility site surveys of multifamily housing buildings, such as apartment complexes, that were built after 1991 to ensure that they are complying with the accessible design and construction requirements of the Fair Housing Act. So for anyone not familiar with civil rights testing, it usually involves, for instance, we would in this case have two testers. One tester, we have a black tester and a white tester, and we might send the white tester in first to a property. So the tester asks if there's any one-bedroom units available. And the agent says, yes, please get your application in soon. Soon after, the black tester comes in and asks for the same thing, right? Asking about a one-bedroom unit, if there's any available. In this case, the agent says, sorry, we don't have any one-bedrooms available right now. Now, without having the white tester, it would be really hard to know whether this was discrimination or, for instance, just, a quick housing market, right? A lot of rentals are quickly going off the market. And so it can be hard sometimes to tell what exactly is happening. So testing helps us look further into, especially more subtle forms of possible discrimination to identify what exactly is going on. So next, I want to talk a bit about the new protected classes in Virginia. Regina also touched a bit on this, so I'm going to mostly focus on source of funds. So source of funds, it became illegal to discriminate on the basis of source of funds in Virginia on July 1st, 2020. And source of funds is just a way to refer to how someone pays their rent. So this could be through income from employment, it could be through a housing choice voucher, other rental assistance programs. For instance, there was pandemic-related emergency rental relief for renters, Social Security, unemployment insurance, veterans benefits, disability benefits, alimony, or any other source of legal income. Source of funds is unfortunately an example where discrimination remains a problem. So as part of our efforts to combat discrimination, the ERC actually conducted a testing investigation recently of 14 Gray Star properties in the Northern Virginia region. And based on our testing, we believe that one property refused to rent to voucher holders, which would likely be illegal. An additional 8 properties had minimum income requirements that likely would also illegally screen out voucher holders from being able to successfully apply. And minimum income requirements is a significant issue of concern that we have seen related to discrimination towards voucher holders, both in Virginia, but also in the district in Maryland as well. So I want to briefly talk about how a minimum income requirement should be applied to a voucher holder. So let's say we have somebody who has a voucher and the rent of the entire unit is $2,000. Now, a minimum income requirement should only look at the portion of the rent that the voucher holder pays, because the rest is going to be covered by the voucher. So in this case, let's say the voucher holder's portion of the rent was $200. So if a minimum income requirement at the building is 3 times the total rent, which is a pretty common one, in this case, they would do 3 times the voucher holder's portion of the rent, which is $200. So 3 times 200 is $600 a month. So that is the minimum income requirement that they should use to determine whether that voucher holder is eligible. Now, in order to help answer any questions people with vouchers may have during their housing searches, we have put together this frequently asked questions sheet that's available on our website for individuals with vouchers. And it goes over what discrimination towards someone with a voucher might look like, what your rights are, and how to report possible discrimination. Additionally, for housing providers and other organizations, I highly recommend checking out this guidance that was issued by the Virginia Real Estate Board and Fair Housing Board in April of 2021. It is about an 8-page document that goes into what the source of funds law means and provides helpful information on things like minimum income requirements and other questions that housing providers may have about compliance with the new source of funds protections. Additionally, as Regina mentioned, sexual orientation is also now included under Virginia's fair housing law. She already talked about the protection itself. I'm just going to give a quick example from the cases we've seen. So we had a lesbian couple contact us about a year ago because they had signed a lease with the housing provider, and at that point the housing provider became aware that it was a same-gender couple. And after signing the lease, the housing provider called them to cancel, saying that they thought that same-gender couples just had too much drama and they didn't want to deal with the drama of lesbian couples. So in this case, we assisted the 2 individuals with filing a housing discrimination complaint. This occurred in DC, so it was with the DC Office of Human Rights, on the basis of sexual orientation. So this is an example of possible sexual orientation discrimination. For gender identity, one example that we've heard from multiple folks is harassment, unfortunately, where tenants might be harassed by other residents or even property management. So for example, a property manager intentionally referring to a tenant by an incorrect name, using the incorrect pronouns. So for instance, if the person's a trans woman, constantly calling her sir, things like that. Or, refusing to process a trans person's maintenance requests, things like that would be considered discriminatory on the basis of gender identity. I also want to go over a couple other fair housing concepts. So first, I want to discuss the terms fair housing, affordable housing, and public housing, because these terms are frequently confused for each other. So fair housing refers to housing that is free from discrimination. Affordable housing refers to housing that is affordable, right, that folks with low incomes can't afford. So this is housing that is generally designed for low-income renters or possibly low-income home buyers. And then public housing is usually a type of affordable housing that is administered by the local city or jurisdiction. So usually it involves a housing authority that administers and runs public housing sites. So these are government-owned and run housing that is designed to be affordable for low-income residents. So public housing is a type of affordable housing, but there is private housing that is also affordable. So while all public housing is generally affordable housing, not all affordable housing is necessarily public housing. Additionally, affordable housing is incredibly important to ensuring fair housing in our communities. We need to make sure that everyone can afford to live in our communities. However, affordable housing isn't necessarily always free from discrimination. So for instance, there have been complaints lodged against local jurisdictions when affordable housing projects are targeted towards the low-income neighborhoods of color, and essentially no affordable housing projects are built in like wealthier white neighborhoods. And in that case, there might be fair housing allegations of race-based discrimination. So all of these concepts are related, and they're all important for ensuring that we have fair housing, but they're not all the same thing. So I just wanted to briefly touch on that. The next concept I want to talk about is disparate impact. So there are two main categories of housing discrimination. The first is known as different treatment, and this is when a housing provider treats people differently based on a protected identity. So for instance, we had a renter come to us in Northern Virginia where the landlord had, meaning to text someone else, had accidentally included her on a group thread that said, I don't want to rent to her, I think she's African, right? And so in this case, we helped her file a complaint with the Virginia Fair Housing Office on the basis of race and national origin discrimination. So this was right. Landlord made an assumption about her race and national origin and refused her housing on that basis. That's different treatment. Disparate impact refers to policies or practices that seem neutral, right? So there's no mention of any protected identity, but even without naming any certain identities, they may disproportionately harm people of certain protected classes. So in order to talk about disparate impact and the difference between disparate impact and different treatment, I want to look at criminal record screenings. A couple years ago, the Equal Rights Center released a report called Unlocking Discrimination. And in it, we had Black women and white women pose as interested housing applicants, both of whom had criminal records, and saw how housing providers responded. So to give you an example of one type of response, the Black tester and white tester both went to a property, and they both disclosed that they had a felony conviction on their records from 15 years ago. In the case of the Black tester, the leasing agent said, yeah, they won't approve you. However, they told the white tester, a third party makes the decision. It depends on the type of crime and how long ago it was. So in this case, we're seeing extremely different responses to the same information. So this would be considered different treatment on the basis of race, right? The agent's response doesn't even seem to be like the same policy by the provider. In one case, he's sure, or they're sure that the Black woman won't be accepted, but on the other hand, the policy seems much more flexible for the white woman. So in this case, it just seems like they are changing their policy based on who's applying, and it would likely be race discrimination. However, in another property, right, if you went onto the online application, you would hit a question that said, have you or any other applicant or occupant ever been convicted of a felony? And if you put yes, a screen would pop up and say that they were unable to continue processing your application, right? The application doesn't know your race when you're submitting this, and anyone who puts yes gets this box, right? So there's no evidence of race-based treatment here, right? But this is likely an example of disparate impact discrimination. And so looking at data in Virginia, we know that unfortunately people of color are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated at much higher rates than white people due to the legacy of racism within our criminal legal system. And so a policy about people with criminal records, even without saying anything about race, is going to have a much larger impact on people of color and especially Black folks in Virginia. So with that, HUD in 2016 released guidance on criminal record screening, saying that it would be illegal for housing providers to consider arrest records. And this is on the basis of disparate impact, where even though a policy related to criminal record screening may not say anything at all about race or national origin, we know that that policy is ultimately going to ensnare more people of color who are applying at places, even though it will also impact white people with criminal records. HUD also stated that felony and conviction bans are illegal. So for instance, if a housing provider says, we don't accept anyone with a felony here, that is likely illegal. And housing providers must make an individualized assessment of a person's criminal record when reviewing their application. Specifically, the housing provider should consider what crime was committed, when the crime occurred, how long it's been since the crime occurred, the age of the person when they committed the crime, and any changes in their situation since then. And the Virginia Office of Attorney General very helpfully released within the last year, I believe, this model policy for tenant screening that explains best practices when reviewing applications, and specifically best practices for criminal background screenings. So for any housing providers, I would highly recommend checking this out as a resource. And the last thing I want to talk about is affirmatively furthering fair housing, which you may have heard referred to as AFFH. It rolls right off the tongue. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is a requirement underneath the Fair Housing Act, and it requires that federal agencies and recipients of federal funding affirmatively work to further fair housing. What this means is that any recipient of federal funding, such as a city, a county, a public housing authority, must strive to dismantle historic patterns of racial segregation, preserve integrated housing that already exists, and otherwise take meaningful steps to further the Fair Housing Act's purposes beyond merely refraining from taking discriminatory actions and banning others from such discrimination. So while the Fair Housing Act made discrimination illegal, right, in 1968, we know that housing discrimination was already occurring and that neighborhood segregation was already entrenched. And so if we just made discrimination illegal from that point forward without working to address the harm, we're just accepting that our neighborhoods are going to be segregated, and we're not undoing any of the harm that's already occurred. So the AFFH rule says, look, we know that discrimination's already happened and that we need to work to address the harms that has already been caused. And so not only do we need to stop any further discrimination, but we also need to make amends for what has already happened. We need to improve our communities. So in 2015, HUD introduced the Assessment of Fair Housing, which, to keep the acronyms going, is abbreviated AFH, not to be mistaken with AFFH. And it required jurisdictions to certify that they were complying with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. So while this rule had been in effect since 1968, there had not been much enforcement of it until 2015, when HUD released this new rule. It also created a standardized method for local jurisdictions to identify local fair housing barriers and goals. And jurisdictions, again, this would be like cities, counties, housing authorities, were able to create more precise fair housing goals, metric, and timelines, meaning that they were able to be more strategic in the ways that they sought to address neighborhood segregation. They also found that they were able to engage more with the community in developing these goals. Since then, after the process was instituted in 2015, it was suspended in 2018. In 2021, part of the AFFH rule was reinstated by HUD. And so jurisdictions are now required again to certify compliance with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Just generally, they're required to certify compliance with that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing, but they're not required to conduct these assessments to identify local barriers or goals. HUD has stated, though, that it plans to undertake separate rulemaking to institute a new fair housing assessment process for jurisdictions. Locally, the DC Metropolitan Area is still conducting a regional analysis of impediments. It's not technically required by HUD, but local governments are working to try to identify ways that we can address entrenched housing discrimination in our community. This process is being led by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments and includes Alexandria, Arlington County, the city of Gaithersburg, the District of Columbia, Fairfax County, Loudoun County, Montgomery County, which is in Maryland, and Prince George's County in Maryland. This regional AI, the analysis for impediments, which outlines fair housing barriers and goals for addressing these barriers, it should include a robust community participation and comment process that allows for meaningful dialogue for key stakeholders, which is a fancy way to say folks that are impacted by these policies, right? So this is residents, could include housing providers, housing counseling agencies, folks that otherwise, have a deep understanding of the local housing context. The report should also include an assessment of past goals and actions, an analysis of data and issues that impact fair housing that could include things like access to schools, access to transportation, housing affordability. So it's not necessarily just neighborhood segregation, and establishment of measurable fair housing goals and priorities so that moving forward, we can work to address those. So with that, I am going to conclude my presentation, and I know that we're holding questions until the end. So let me stop sharing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Susie. That was great information. And yes, you're right. We're going to hold questions until we have our third and final presentation from Karl Rush, who's the Chief Equity Officer for Loudoun County. Karl, do you have slides as well? Or
I do not have slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Office of Equity and the importance to fair housing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hello, once again, my name is Karl Rush. I'm the Chief Equity Officer for Loudoun County. In this capacity, I lead the Office of Equity and Inclusion for our government, where I'm responsible for developing the overarching strategy and the goals to promote and to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout our organization and throughout our departments, including the Department of Housing and Community and Development. For the gist of our conversation, we're going to take a little bit of a tour through history and how we've gotten to the point where we are now. While most people are aware that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a civil rights movement leader, fewer are familiar with his role in the fair housing movement. During the 20th century, we recognize that people of color were systemically deprived of sufficient and quality housing because they were routinely and openly excluded from living in certain areas. So with that, we recognize that things like discrimination, intimidation, exclusion, and even violence segregated these communities and relegated Black people and people of color and lower income earners to areas of very poor conditions with housing. But although Dr. King's fight for equality was evident in that time, we recognize that the next step in that phase was through equity. And in today's environment, it is critical to understand the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it's in tandem with fair housing. And understanding these three concepts, we open the doors to learning about our communities, the culture within our community, but also to understand the vehicle in which we can use to attain fair housing. Fair housing focuses on laws and regulations such as the Fair Housing Act. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a ways and a means to achieving fair housing. And all in Loudoun County should have the guarantee to fair and equitable housing opportunities. And our aim is to increase equity and to reduce barriers of opportunity for any persons living or working within Loudoun County. The Loudoun County government is committing to increasing equity and eliminating identified barriers as evident in our Unmet Housing Needs Strategic Plan. But on a more federal level, on January 26, 2021, President Biden released a memorandum on redressing our nation's and the federal government's history on discriminatory housing practices and policies. And this memorandum really focused on the legacy and the ongoing legacy in residential segregation, discrimination, and the critical role that the federal government played and how by embedding these things, it gave way to disproportionately affecting different groups. In that memorandum, this is what it stated. It said the federal government must recognize and acknowledge its role in systemically declining to invest in communities of color and preventing residents of those communities from accessing the same services and resources as their white counterparts. The effects of these policy decisions continue to be felt today as racial inequality still permeates land use patterns in most of the United States sites and virtually all aspects of the housing market. My friends, we recognize that the Congress enacted the Fair Housing Act more than 50 years ago, and it was aimed to lift the barriers that created separate and unequal neighborhoods based on race, ethnicity, and national origin. But since then, however, access to housing and the creation of wealth through home ownership still remains persistently unequal in the United States. And that trickle-down effect shows us that Loudoun County is not immune to these effects of these systemic practices. But our overall goal is to build strong and resilient community here in Loudoun. And these are a couple areas that I had focused on, is that when you look at our children's future should not be determined by their zip code or where he or she lives. And unfortunately, educational attainment, employment, the upward mobility, and even healthcare could be affected by a person's street address and their neighborhood. We should not be able to determine those things and be able to discriminate based on where someone lives. Our community also, as we look at our local leaders, are striving to identify obstacles that limit the access to opportunities for Loudoun residents. This may be through like land use, our housing policies, how we look at transportation, even lending practices that prevent people from having quality housing and good schools and so forth. But also as we continue, we look at this in a present, past, and future perspective, recognizing that the lingering and lasting effects of segregation will rear its ugly head in several different areas if we're not cognizant of that. And if we're not cognizant of that, we may perpetuate or exacerbate those effects on different communities as well. So keeping a close eye on that and seeking to eliminate those areas that disproportionately affect people of color and low-income families in our community. But we're also committed to helping our residents to reach their full potential. And it's true that in inclusive regions, ones that are intentionally focused on inclusion, there's a lower income inequality, there's less segregative practices, and there's better access and greater economic growth in those areas and chances for ones to have that upward mobility. And we see this definitely when it comes to housing as well. The Office of Equity has established for the county an equity lens for all departments. And our equity lens introduces a set of vital questions that ones can use when they're making decisions with having equity both in the process, but also in the outcomes. And just wanted to share what that equity lens contains and some of the questions. So when ones are making decisions, whether it's an application or whether major decisions that affect ones in the community, they would ask questions within that decision-making group of the decision that we're about to make. Who does it benefit? Who does it negatively impact? What group or individuals? Who's missing from the table and who should be involved in this conversation? Really being poignant about our community engagement there. How do we know? What do we do? And how did we do it? And so as mentioned, this is the equity lens where we'll go and we'll ask these questions. And when we recognize that there is an inequity, we seek to change those as well. And this is an ongoing process as we continue to roll this out through the county and all that we do. So as we've mentioned, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law 1 week after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. To date, over 50 years since the passage of the Fair Housing Act, we've made progress. but there's still a lot of work for us to achieve in this realm of fair housing. But rest assured, we are committed to the vision of fair housing, but most importantly, working to its complete fruition as well. So I thank you all so much for allowing me to share this space with you at this time. This is definitely an important conversation, and it is a commitment to continue to work with the Department of Housing and Community Development to ensure that fair housing is evident in Loudoun County.
Great. Thank you so much, Karl, for the history around the Fair Housing Act, for sure, and for that great overview of the work that the Office of Equity and Inclusion has started here in Loudoun. I am going to make myself the presenter again. And I'm going to, if it's okay, invite all of the panelists to come back on camera with me. And we will start our question and answer session. We have a full half an hour, so if you did have a question, as Regina Cheney, Susie McClanahan, or Karl Rush were speaking, now would be the time to put that question in the chat. We do have a couple of things already in the chat, so I'll start with what's here already. But if there is anything that you haven't had a chance to put in there yet, please do so now. And I did also just want to note that my colleague Eileen Barnhart, who is our CDBG program manager, is also online to help me monitor the chat. And Eileen is very involved in that assessment of fair housing and the affirmatively furthering fair housing and regional analysis of impediments to fair housing work that Susie was talking about. So just wanted to say hi to Eileen. Okay, so the first question we have in chat is this. One of the presenters mentioned that it's illegal to deny housing if someone had a previous criminal record. But the presenter also mentioned that the landlord can ask the when, what, how, etc. Would that mean that depending on what they did and when they did it, it would mark the difference in accepting or denying an application? So, and I might throw that one, I don't know, does anyone want to take that one, Susie or Regina?
I'm happy to take that, Regina, unless you want to answer it. I'll go ahead. So,
yeah, go ahead.
HUD,
Yeah.
So criminal records are not a protected class underneath the Fair Housing Act, but race and national origin are. And so what HUD said in its 2016 memo is that overly broad criminal record screenings may be discriminatory under a disparate impact analysis based on national origin and race. So housing providers are able to do criminal record screenings for potential tenants, but it is important that your screening involves an individualized assessment as opposed to overly broad policies that may unfairly screen individuals out. So HUD clearly stated that reviewing arrest records would be illegal, as well as having what are called felony or conviction bans at a property, where you say no one with a conviction or no one with a felony can live here. I would really recommend, for further information about best practices for criminal record screenings, to check out the Virginia Office of Attorney General's guidance on the model tenant screening policy, as well as the 2016 HUD guidance on criminal record screenings, because there's a lot of good information in both of those. I'm also happy to field further questions via email. I just don't want to get too in the weeds right now, but hopefully that's clarifying.
I'd like to add something to that, just as an example, because when I was on the fair housing team a couple of years ago, it's about 3 years ago, we did have a criminal history case where the person's I guess conviction was I think 7 years old, and they were looking to move into a larger unit. They had actually lived in the unit for a while with their partner, and management knew they were there, but it wasn't until they decided to move into a larger unit and they had to reapply that management just used the rule that because that person had a felony, that they were not, the application was denied. Well, we worked with that family to secure them legal assistance. And actually, it took about 18 months. But the result of that was that that particular housing provider did have to put they had to put in place a criminal history screening policy because they didn't have one. Plus, they had to pay that individual $40,000. So, although it's not a protected class, they're, just working, as Susie said, to get the details and to know what the guidelines are. And if you feel that something has happened, if you have a criminal history or know someone who has one and they've been treated unfairly or just denied housing because of it, definitely we would like to talk to you as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Susie and Regina. And Susie, I just wanted to make sure the two resources that you mentioned, they were in your presentation. Is that right?
Yes, and I'd be
Yeah.
happy to send the links to you to share out as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, come on. I need some more questions here in the chat. What other questions do folks have?
Lack of question means that we did such a thorough job in our presentations.
I think that's probably for sure the case, Regina. So I'm just going to wait just a minute for folks to type anything else that they might have. While people are thinking, I have a question just to kind of throw out there for informational purposes. Can someone just talk a little bit about local fair housing protections? So we talked about federal protections, state protections, and protected classes. Can someone talk a little bit about the local protections and how that works in Loudoun County? So I don't know if Susie, maybe you want to take that. Like, I know that there is a slide that that I've seen before where it says like Fairfax County has a local ordinance and other jurisdictions might have a local ordinance. Can you talk a little bit about how that works in Loudoun?
Well, Virginia's a bit more complicated than other states due to the Dillon rule, which I think makes it hard, if not impossible, for local jurisdictions to pass additional protected classes that are more expansive than the state law. Regina, I don't know if you have more expertise on this or anyone else on this call than I do, but that's kind of the knowledge I have. So while Loudoun County has, I assume, a fair housing ordinance that mirrors Virginia's fair housing law more broadly, I don't know of additional protected classes in Loudoun County due to the restrictions placed on the county by the state. If anyone else wants to double check that, I would.
Regina, did you want to jump in?
No, actually, I'm not aware. So I'm with Susie. I'll have to do more research myself because that's a good question.
I think the one thing I wanted to point out is that the Virginia state protections apply to the whole state. Yeah.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I have in some conversations and trainings in areas of Northern Virginia to find out that there is some belief that because the what's the thing called, the Housing Human Resource Commissions, I think sometimes will take fair housing complaints, but their protections aren't the same as the state, which I don't understand that. And that's not in Northern Virginia. I've seen that happen in other parts of the state. But the people need to understand, if you have an issue and for some reason your locality is saying, well, that's not part of our protection, so that's not something that we can address, then you definitely need to contact Home or the Equal Rights Center or Virginia Fair Housing Office to address that particular situation. I just found that really interesting that it's not the same as the state, so. But anyway, I want people to know that there are options and that all is not lost.
Great. And it was said earlier, and I'll put all those links in the chat before we end, that if someone in Loudoun County does feel like they've been, that they have experienced discrimination, they can report to the Virginia State Fair Housing Office, they can report to HUD, and they can reach out to both Home or Equal Rights Center to access those services. We also have Legal Services of Northern Virginia here in Loudoun County that can also provide legal advice. So.
And I did want to also make the comment that oftentimes when folk feel like something is wrong, it is not necessary that you have all the details. Okay, and I mean, the more details you have, the more information you have, it's better. But you know, don't necessarily want to check the boxes. When you call us to talk about what happened, allow us to help you figure out, you know, to fine tune that complaint or figure out whether or not it is fair housing or whether it's landlord tenant, because there is a fine line between fair housing and landlord tenant. So, but to just call and talk about it, what happened, is important. Not to just say, well, I don't think that this is fair housing, or it doesn't match what I know about fair housing. It doesn't matter. Call and talk about it and allow us to, just have that discussion.
Great, thank you. We do have another good question that's come into the chat. And this is it against the Fair Housing Act or laws to terminate a lease agreement because a family has kids who are constantly running in a condo unit and disturbing other residents?
Regina, would you like to take that one?
Well, I just want to say that we have had, I've actually worked on a case like that in, I forgot what county it was, somewhere west of Charlottesville, where that actually was happening. And, it depends on the details of kind of what happened and how long and what's been going on. So it is case by case. I can say it could be a violation and there could be some other issues. So that's one of those cases where you would need to call and talk about what happened, how it happened, when it happened, so that we can figure that out. Because the case that I worked on that was similar, and it was the kids, supposedly they were disturbing the peace for the other residents in this complex. And actually, they won the case. And it was settled, but it depends. It depends. So, Susie?
Yeah, I can give another example to highlight what you said. So the details are really important. If there is any household that is, committing noise violations, that may be a reason to, proffer a lease violation notice. But for instance, we had a household in Northern Virginia where there was a child with disabilities who was making more noise, and the parents were actively working with the child to address it. And however, the landlord had been issuing notices based on a neighbor's complaints about these noise violations. Yet the neighbor had actually trespassed into the family's home to threaten them about the noise violations, and the landlord had taken no action against what, I would consider to be a much more severe disruption of the peace, right? Somebody entering your home without your permission and scaring you and your family and your young child. And they didn't take any action against that neighbor, didn't issue a lease violation or anything. So we had contacted, because we were alleging discrimination based on unequal rules enforcement, where in this case, families with children were being targeted for violations, while other residents without children were not getting this similar violations. So I think it's really important that rules are being applied equally. And that's kind of where the further details are needed to answer this question.
Great, thank you. And I think one of you said earlier, it's okay to not have all of those details or have all the answers before you reach out to one of your organizations to get some support. Great. There is another question in the chat about the Equal Rights Center, just about the work that you do. It says, can you just tell me a little bit about whether the Equal Rights Center serves other states, and maybe Susie, we could take a little bit of time here for you to answer that question, but also just give again an overview of what Equal Rights Center does. And maybe Regina, you could also talk with folks about like what are the service areas of the two organizations and how does that work? Thanks.
Yeah, that sounds great. So the Equal Rights Center, we are based in Washington, D.C., and we serve all of Northern Virginia, which essentially kind of think down to Fredericksburg and then kind of up and out. We actually serve all the way over into Jefferson County, West Virginia, and then we serve the district itself and the state of Maryland. We provide services for individuals who are experiencing discrimination in our service region. We can assist either to try to directly resolve the issue with the housing provider. We can do testing. We can help folks with disabilities submit requests for accommodations or modifications. And we can also help people through the complaint process. And you're going to hear Home has very similar services as well. Additionally, beyond that, we also provide compliance services to housing providers, both like training and testing to help ensure that they are, utilizing best practices in the fair housing context. We also have a robust testing program, and our testing program is not only housing related, we also do testing in the public accommodation sphere, which are like businesses, places of business, things like restaurants, movie theaters, that sort of thing. We do employment-based testing as well as language access testing for like government services, hospitals, that sort of thing. But our housing services are specifically for folks experiencing housing discrimination. It's regional to the DC metropolitan area.
And with regards to Home, we do a lot of what Susie just mentioned, but we don't do employment or anything outside of housing, but definitely anything related to housing discrimination. We also test, and we will assist with, like I said, preparing a complaint. We will write RAs, RMs for folks who are needing them, persons with disabilities. Our other services that I mentioned earlier, well, first of all, Home as also a civil rights organization, our fair housing services are available statewide. Our foreclosure prevention services or counseling is also statewide. The down payment assistance down payment assistance and our mobility program, which is the program to assist families with housing choice vouchers, that is sort of a regional, well, actually metropolitan because it's Richmond, Henrico, Chesterfield. I'm more regional. Richmond, Henrico, Chesterfield, Hanover, Goochland, and Powhatan. The rental assistance that we're actually doing now is, well, one program is ending this month. That was the rental relief program. We actually did that for the state, but that's about to end. I hope I'm not telling too much. I'm not sure if everybody knows that, but that's about to end. And the other rental assistance program that we administer is more local. So statewide is really foreclosure and fair housing, those services.
No, that's not saying too much. That's important information that the state rental relief program, the portal will be closing on May 15th.
Right, we're supposed to go through June, so yeah, that's sort of a.
Well, thank you both for that overview. I am actually going to also put in the chat the link for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments fair housing work, and this is about the regional analysis of impediments to fair housing, the piece that Susie talked about earlier. You can get updates there. And I don't see any other questions in the chat. You're right, Regina. Maybe we just did such a good job of providing the information. Karl, I'm going to throw it to you. Do you have any other comments or concluding thoughts that you wanted to share?
No, I just wanted to thank the other panelists as well. A lot of great information here, and just the dedication here in Loudoun County towards fair housing. It's just been something that has impressed me, as well. And I'm just a phone call away. I don't have my information here as well. If you can share that with the group as well, But as I said, the Office of Equity and Inclusion is here to support the Department of Housing and Community Development every step of the way with this, and especially through our Unmet Housing Needs Strategic Plan.
Great. Well, with that, this is the final call for any questions. And if people don't have any other questions, we can give you 10 minutes of time back. That's fine. So as Karl said, I also want to just really thank Regina Cheney with Home of Virginia and Susie McClanahan with the Equal Rights Center, and Karl Rush, Chief Equity Officer with Loudoun County, for taking the time today to provide this overview. I will make sure that the information gets back out to folks who registered, the slides and the resources that we discussed. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach back out to me. Eileen, anything that I'm missing or anything?
I did want to say one thing. I mean, in addition to thanking everybody for their wonderful presentations, I did want to add that we are working with COG, and it was identified in Susie's slide, all the participating jurisdictions. We will be coming out, we're in the final throes of reviewing the draft of the regional analysis of impediments that will apply, and then we have our local section for Loudoun as well. So that will be coming out. We'll be looking for sometime in June, hopefully, that we'll put it out for public review and comment. So that is, keep that on your radar, and we're putting the word out that this will be available for people to look at and to comment on. So thank you, and again, thank you to all the participants and for our presenters. Bye.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Eileen. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon and happy Fair Housing Month. Take care.